Welcome everyone to this joint presentation by Nucleus Network and 360 Biolabs on the topic of why Australia is the world's vaccine hotspot. Our speakers today are Nucleus Network CEO Cameron Johnson and 360 Biolabs Executive Vice President Business Development Angela Luttick. Cameron is considered one of the most experienced Phase 1 clinical trial professionals in Australia, having held senior management roles across multiple Phase 1 clinical trial organisations. Cameron's Phase 1 experience extends to Europe and the clinical research organisation industry, where he managed clinical trial facilities across Australia and New Zealand. He joined Nucleus Network in September 2013 and in 2018 led the sale of the company to private equity firm Crescent Capital Partners. Nucleus Network has since evolved to become Australia's largest Phase 1 clinical trials organisation and the only Phase 1 clinical trials organisation with multiple Phase 1 clinic facilities in Australia and in the USA. Angela Luttick is a virologist with more than 20 years' experience in the discovery, development and commercialisation of novel drugs. She's well accustomed to leading multidisciplinary teams and experienced in the generation and integrity of key discovery stage biological data required for the preparation of IND packages and used in filing numerous FDA submissions. Angela is a co-founder and executive director of 360 Biolabs and leads business development and strategy for company growth. I now hand over to Cameron and Angela to present on today's topic.
Excellent. Thank you for the introduction there. And prior to launching into the actual content of the presentation, and an absolute promise, this will be the only sales slide that you see throughout the slide deck, I really just wanted to present this to provide you with an understanding of the types of experiences we're talking to shape this presentation, specifically as it relates to US companies conducting early phase clinical trials in Australia. So at a high level, Nucleus has been in operation since 2002. On an annual basis, we run around about 70 phase 1 studies per year in Australia, and really about 50 of those phase 1 studies are true first in humans. So, and also wanted to point out that we have previously been involved in FDA inspections, EMA inspections, and have previously held ANVISA certification. I also think it's relevant to point out that Nucleus Network is currently conducting 2 COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials. And as publicly disclosed, we're working with Novavax and also the University of Queensland. And there are also further COVID-19 vaccine studies that will be commencing at Nucleus within the coming months.
So 360 Biolabs has an industry experienced executive team. As part of the intro, you'll be aware that our industry experience involves biopharmaceuticals. Both have moved offshore in 2015, and the team who had struggled to find good service providers in Australia launched 360 Biolabs. So our clients really enjoy knowing that we've been in their shoes. Our laboratories offer PK and PD all in one laboratory, and if we don't have assays available, we can develop something that's specific for a drug or specific for a client's needs. We have GLP accreditation as well as ISO 17025 and 15189, and all of our reporting and validation is ICH, FDA and EMEA compliant. So you will receive delivery, high quality delivery of data on time every time. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background into the R&D landscape and clinical landscape of Australia. So Australia has conducted about 5 million enrolled patients into clinical trials over the last few years. So I think the most important point to note here is that in 2016, of the 13 new FDA approved drugs, 7 had phase 3 clinical trials conducted in Australia. So we conduct more than about 1,300 clinical trials per year. And greater than 500 participants enrol in these clinical trials in Australia every year. So clinical trials are a robust part of the ecosystem within Australia.
Sure. And then to expand a little bit further in terms of what are the key drivers for overseas clients coming to Australia to place their early phase work. So in terms of a take-home message for the presentation, there's probably 4 key elements that are driving the early phase industry in Australia. And whilst I'll go into these in a little bit of detail in the subsequent slides, just as a high level, it's based around speed, and that speed into clinic, the quality standards of the data that Australia generates, cost obviously plays into a factor. And then one of the last points that we'll go into quite a bit of detail on is really that specialisation. And by specialisation, I mean the extensive specialist services and assays that we have available within Australia to support vaccine trials. So from a speed aspect, so really the key takeaway here is that in order to conduct a clinical trial in Australia, you do not need to have opened an IND. So essentially no IND is required in order to initiate a clinical trial in Australia. It's really, really important to note that the preclinical package in Australia is identical to that of the US FDA. So it's not that there's any abbreviation in terms of the toxicology, safety pharmacology studies that can be done, but the real pivot point and the real time saving in coming to Australia is that once you've got your draft reports, it's your draft reports that can go into the investigator's brochure, and then that investigator's brochure and protocol are what gets submitted to the IRB in Australia that are essentially responsible for the review and approval of a clinical trial. In terms of our experiences, that pivot point from the draft reports into first patient, first dose, on average saves around about 6 months off clinical development timelines. And in terms of the actual approval process, you're looking at around about a 4 to 5 week process. It is also worth pointing out, though, that in the current environment of COVID, there's obviously expedited COVID-19 approvals. And just on the right there, I wanted to point out in terms of a real life example as to the COVID-19 timelines that we've been working to. So you can see there that within a 2-week period of the ethics documents or the protocol, the IB and the consent form being available, and in terms of when we actually received approval for that clinical trial, in total was a 14-day process. And then from that, we obviously had first patient, first dose that was done once in the investigational product had been shipped to as Australia and was available. So you can certainly see there that sort of that pivot point of not having the IND, having draft reports and getting into clinic quickly really is one of the major draw cards. And it's also worth pointing out that Australia only requires a limited CMC package. It's nothing like what the US FDA require in terms of you don't need a large dossier of CMC information. The only CMC requirements for Australia is really what goes into the investigator's brochure, which we typically see as little as sort of a page and a half. So then as we sort of drop into sort of the quality aspects, as I mentioned sort of early on in the presentation, that Australia, the data that's generated in Australia is acceptable to the FDA, the EMEA, PMDA, Health Canada, and we can certainly talk to a lot of real life case studies where Australia has generated that first in human data. It's that first in human data that has then been taken back into the US. The companies then opened their INDs and moved directly into phase 2, with the Australian phase 1 data really being the major factor that was used in opening that IND and being able to support a phase 2 study. And then when we drop into cost, I'd like to point out first of all that certainly Australia has a very, very, very favourable exchange rate these days. Our Aussie dollar certainly isn't anywhere near as strong as what the US dollar is. So really straight off, if you were looking at coming to Australia with the exchange rate fluctuations at the moment, you know, as a head-to-head comparison, we're already about 30 to 35% cheaper than what the same study would be to conduct that in the USA. And it is also worth pointing out, and I think this is probably the aspect that get a lot of companies quite interested in Australia, is that the R&D tax incentive system. Basically what that means is that if you're a company that's got revenues of less than 20 million and you're prepared to set up a subsidiary in Australia, for every dollar that you spend in Australia on R&D, the Australian government potentially will give back 43.5 cents back in cash into the Australian bank account that would need to be established. So we certainly find that, and with this presentation, we put cost last in that the main draw card is really the speed. the quicker that companies can get into clinic, that's the real value added measure of coming to Australia. And for those companies that qualify for the R&D, it's really the icing on the cake or the cherry on top. But it very much is the speed and quality that is the driving force behind companies coming to Australia. And then in terms of what type of companies are coming to Australia to conduct their early phase studies. So, it's fair to say that we see the whole gamut come through. So anything from your large pharmaceutical companies, through to your biotechnology companies. And as I pointed out in sort of my opening introduction there, is that, through to universities and academic institutions. So certainly we found that it's probably the biotechnology sector that has probably enjoyed that value proposition of Australia, that speed, quality, cost, a little bit more than what the larger pharmaceutical companies have. I think obviously biotechnology companies with limited cash burn, that want to have limited cash burn and getting to clinic much, much quicker than what maybe some of your standard larger pharma companies are, is really why we see certainly in our experiences, quite a large uptake in biotechnology companies. It's also interesting to note as well that, although not on this slide, of the 70 or so phase 1 studies that Nucleus conduct per year, it's fair to say that 97% of all of those studies are for overseas companies. So we very, very much are, an exporter of services, and certainly, very familiar, with the requirements of certain the regulatory bodies from around the world. And then just to sort of go a little bit more granular, so in terms of what types of early phase vaccine trials are being conducted in Australia, obviously in this current environment, it's fair to point out that COVID-19 vaccine trials have certainly experienced a lot of good publicity here in Australia. Obviously, the number of COVID-19 cases in Australia is remarkably lower compared to most other parts of the world. And certainly people are seeing Australia as a relatively safe haven to get not only vaccine trials conducted, but also other types of first-in-human studies as well. And then as we sort of delve more into sort of the vaccine space, when we really wrap up that whole kind of infectious disease type angle, really wanted to sort of point out that over the last 10 to 15 years, there's extensive experience in things like malaria vaccines, dengue, cholera, Ross River, influenza vaccine trials, obviously more on a seasonal basis, but also being involved in Ebola vaccine trials, Japanese encephalitis. So it really is pretty broad in terms of what types of vaccine trials are able to be conducted here in Australia. And also worth pointing out that we have been, we have experience in a lot of the major vaccine platforms, mRNA, GMOs, and live attenuated as well. And then also there's been, various novel delivery methods that we've been involved in. So intranasal, intradermal type vaccine studies. So the actual, scope of vaccine trials being done, the administrations, the technologies being used, there's certainly very, very good experience in country on a lot of that. And then really, as we sort of delve into the next part, so when we look at specialisation of the types of assays and services available in Australia.
So just to build on the capabilities a little bit further there, that Australia does have to support vaccine trials. This slide here just gives you a few details about the types of viruses that the team here at 360 has supported. So obviously SARS-CoV-2 is a hot topic at the moment, and due to our low positivity rate, we are seeing a lot of COVID-19 vaccine trials come to Australia. We've currently got a suite of assays available to support these assays. A lot of flu and RSV and other respiratory virus vaccine trials do come to Australia, as Cameron mentioned, but there's also a range of others. So 360 Biolabs has PC2 and PC3 laboratories. So that allows us to be able to support a wide range of different virus assays, as well as development of ELISAs that are specific to vaccines. We do a lot of PBMC isolation, and about 40 to 50% of our work's flow cytometry. So we can really delve into the immunology and the virology associated with vaccines and their responses in humans. So just to delve a little bit deeper into our virology experience, obviously, as we said at the start of the presentation, I am a virologist. So the virology team here at 360 Biolabs can support every endpoint that you'd need really to measure a virus, from whole virus assays through to resistance characterization and a whole suite of different tests. So our immunology team just builds on this, so we can do ligand-based ELISAs and also cell-based assays where we can measure really specific cell types and their responses to a vaccine. We're also doing a lot of cytokine analysis, ADAs, ADCC, and ELISpot assays as well. And our molecular team gets involved most of the time when we're doing some quantitative or qualitative PCR. We do a lot of whole genome sequencing as well, and we've even over times that are a little bit less related to vaccines, but been asked to do some of those less traditional or more traditional and less used these days assays like gene expression via Western's blot and molecular race assays. So the team is really quite diverse and can support any endpoint that comes from a clinical trial. And this last slide here, we just thought would be worthwhile is hearing some words from the converted, let's say. So as Cameron mentioned before, Novavax were very pleased to come back to 360 and Nucleus network to support their COVID clinical trial. And we've also had a lot of great experiences with the UK company Vacutech. They were very, very happy for us to announce that they saved over 6 months on their program. The recruitment was exceeded expectation. And they were able to save about 40% on their overall budget for conducting the clinical trial. They also did use the seasonal advantage where they were able to run part of the clinical trial in the Northern Hemisphere and then follow the season straight down to the Southern Hemisphere. So that certainly factored into them being able to save a lot of time. And then the other anonymous team who made some comments on the left-hand side of your screen there, they just found it so useful to be able to do it in Australia and flip between hemispheres as well. Obviously, the tax incentive is extremely important to them, and also an English-speaking country. So a lot of APAC does attract clinical trials, but given Australia and the English-speaking workforce, it certainly is very easy to conduct clinical trials in Australia.
Well, that was an excellent overview of the vaccine clinical trials landscape in Australia and a great insight into the very relevant topic of COVID-19 vaccine trials. Before we head off, Andrew and Cam, I do have some questions for you, starting with, how were you able to find participants for trials in the current pandemic?
Yeah, sure. I'll answer that one. So it's actually been quite interesting in that obviously, as a lot of people would be aware, there's been a lot of industries that has really been decimated by the pandemic, particularly when we look at sort of hospitality, so looking at travel, looking at restaurants, bars, etc., where unfortunately there obviously is a lot of people that are out of work and currently unemployed. So it's been interesting that we've actually seen a very different type of demographic enroll into clinical trials. So, you know, historically one would think that it was sort of the backpackers and university students. Obviously with border closures, etc., the backpacker population is a lot less, but certainly that's been supplemented and more with a change in really economic conditions. So it was actually interesting, and some of the stats that we track internally is that we've seen a lot of our highest conversion rates ever. So in terms of people that actually register their interest for a clinical trial and then actually, you know, do turn up to actually do the screening appointment and then sort of enroll into the study, we've had some of the highest conversion rates than we've seen previously. So certainly from a recruitment aspect, there's been positive uptake in what is obviously a very unfortunate situation.
Okay, interesting. Another one that's come through is that Australia is well known for first-in-human clinical trials, but do you also support phase 2 studies as well?
Yeah, so that's a question that we often get. If 360 Biolabs has set up assays to support the first-in-human clinical trials and they've performed and been conducted very, very well, a client will often not want to go away and leave 360 Biolabs. So the great thing about the assays that are conducted for vaccine trials is a lot of the samples can just be frozen. So once phase 2 clinical trials open up around the rest of the globe, it's very easy just to ship samples back into Australia and into 360 Biolabs to be able to support the phase 2 and ongoing clinical trials. So it is really easy to continue working with the Australian teams once you've done your phase 1 here.
Excellent. And on that, are the results of the data provided FDA compliant?
Yeah, we can probably both take that one. So certainly from a Nucleus point of view and from the actual sort of clinical operations aspect, absolutely. To be honest, we've never had an instance where a company has come to Australia, conducted their phase 1 study, taken it back to the US, where it's been rejected or there's been any significant concerns or anything like that. So certainly, nearly 18, 19 years of corporate history with the data that's being generated in Australia being acceptable to the FDA. And Ange, did you want to sort of elaborate on the data side from the lab?
Yeah, sure. Because we follow ICH or are part of ICH, it means that our data must be accepted by the FDA. So that's always a comfort. And so the data that generated in Australia is FDA compliant, and so the FDA very rarely do question the data that comes from 360 and from the Australian sites.
Excellent. Another question that's come through is, what's the typical time frame for vaccine trial establishment in Australia?
Yeah, sure. So I'll answer that from a clinical aspect. So once we've got the actual protocol and the investigator's brochure, and then we typically take care of the informed consent and any other sort of governance type documents. Really from time of final documents to actual approval of the clinical trial is we typically look for a vaccine around about that 4 to 5 week period. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, COVID is a very different environment where there is the expedited path. We have seen a trial approved within sort of 7 to 10 days, but typically we're seeing about, that 10 to 14 days from time of submission, the back and forth questions to actually get that approval certificate, around about 10 to 14 days for COVID type trials in Australia. And Ange, in terms of sort of leading time for yourself?
Yeah, sure. So we usually allow a 6-week period to get assays developed and validated. So it's a very fast timeline as well. We like to be engaged with the client as soon as they're starting to write protocols, so that as the HREC approval comes through, the assays are being developed and validated, and we're ready to get a clinical start as soon as first patient, first dose occurs.
Excellent. Well, that's all the questions we've got. Thanks for those responses. Again, excellent presentation, and it's available at our virtual booth at the conference where 360 Biolabs and NN Nucleus Network have further information about our offerings. Thanks for joining us today, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.